The sunflowers were dead. Cora noticed it the moment she stepped outside, her worn leather boots sinking into the thin crust of early frost that had formed overnight across the clearing. The stalks stood rigid and brown against the pale morning sky, their heavy heads bowed low as if in mourning. She had planted them in late spring, 37 of them, arranged in a deliberate arc around the northern and western walls of her cabin. The other Omegas had laughed at her then. Even old Marin, who usually held her tongue, had shaken her head with the particular pity reserved for those who waste effort on foolish things. Decorations, Bram had called them, the word dripping with contempt as he'd passed her on the path to the storage house. The little Omega is playing in her garden. She hadn't corrected him. The wind came down from the mountain in slow, deliberate waves, carrying the sharp bite of pine resin and something older beneath it. The smell of ice moving through stone, of weather that had not yet arrived but was already inevitable. Cora pressed her fingertips against the nearest stalk and felt it resist. The root system beneath that dark soil was deeper than anyone had bothered to look. She had made certain of that. She pulled her wool shawl tighter across her shoulders and looked up at the sky. The clouds were the color of pewter, layered and dense, sitting low over the ridge with the particular heaviness that meant serious snowfall. Not a passing dusting. Not the kind that melted by afternoon. This was the blizzard she had been counting on. She turned back toward the cabin and pushed open the door, stepping into the warmth of the small space. A fire burned in the stone hearth, modest, measured, the kind she built to last. Hanging from the rafters were dried herbs in tight bundles, yarrow, pine bark, elderflower, and several others that had no common names among the pack, but that her grandmother had pressed into her palms when Cora was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen table. "Not all strength is carried in muscle, little one," her grandmother had said. "Some of it lives in what you know." Cora was 24 years old and had lived in this cabin at the edge of pack territory for nearly 3 years. She had been assigned to it, not chosen it, after the ranking ceremonies placed her at the bottom of every category the elders measured: speed, strength, aggression, social standing. She had accepted the assignment without protest. The elders had interpreted her silence as resignation. That, too, she had not corrected. She was lifting a clay pot from the shelf when she heard the horn. One long note, then 2 short ones. The signal pattern cut through the mountain air with sharp authority, and Cora set the pot down slowly. She had heard that call only twice in her life. The first time, she had been a child watching from a high window as the AlphaKing's riders swept through the valley below. The second time had been the day his messengers came to collect the season's tribute from their pack. The AlphaKing himself had never come to Iron Ridge. Until, apparently, now. She moved to the single window on the eastern wall and looked through the warped glass toward the main path. Riders were visible in the distance. 6 of them, their dark cloaks cutting against the white-gray landscape. At the center rode a figure on a black horse so large it seemed to belong to a different scale than everything around it. Even from this distance, there was something in the way the rider sat, absolutely still while the horse moved beneath him, that made the word danger rise in Cora's chest without her permission. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched. The pack would be scrambling now. The beta would be pulling on his formal vest. The elder women would be rushing the younger ones inside to change into presentable clothing. There would be fires lit in the great hall, dried fruits pulled from the storage house, whatever impression of abundance Iron Ridge could assemble on short notice. No one would think to warn Cora. She went back to her pot. He had not intended to stop at Iron Ridge. Lucian had been riding since dawn, pushing south toward the border territories where 3 packs had reported unusual movement along the contested forest line. The detour through Iron Ridge was a concession to practicality. The horses needed water, the sky was closing in above the mountain pass, and his lead rider, a gray-bearded man named Aldrich, had quietly pointed out that pressing through the incoming weather without rest would be foolish, even for the AlphaKing. Lucian had not agreed out loud, but he had turned the horse. Now he sat in the great hall of Iron Ridge's main lodge, a fire burning to his left, watching the Pack's beta, a broad man named Harwick who sweated even in cold rooms, speak with the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times, and was now discovering that the reality was slightly more slippery than the rehearsal. "We are honored, my king. Truly, we were not expecting." "I know you weren't," Lucian said. He took the cup of water offered by a young packmate and drank without ceremony. He did not touch the food arranged across the table. He never ate in places where the welcome came layered too thick over something else, and there was something else here. He could feel it in the careful arrangement of who stood where, which faces showed relief, and which showed the faint shadow of calculation. His gaze moved to the window. Outside, the sky had darkened considerably in the past hour. The clouds were moving with intent now, pressing down toward the valley with the weight of something serious. He had seen blizzards from this mountain range before. They moved fast and hit hard. "How many shelters can your lodge hold in a storm?" he asked, cutting across whatever Harwick had been saying. The beta blinked. "My king? If that weather breaks tonight, and it will, how many people can this hall hold safely?" Harwick looked around as if the walls might answer. "Perhaps 40, perhaps 50 if—" "How many in your pack?" 63, my king, but most have sturdy enough homes, and the storm will be worse than you are accounting for." Lucian set down the cup. "Tell me about your outer buildings, the ones on the edge of the settlement." There was a pause, the kind that meant something. "There are a few storage structures," Harwick said carefully, "and one small cabin to the northwest. It's assigned to one of our lower-ranked members, an Omega. She manages well enough on her own." Lucian looked at him. One person alone on the outer edge in that direction. "She is accustomed to it, my king." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Show me." The knock, when it came, was not the anxious, rapid-fire knock of a packmate bringing news. It was 3 solid strikes, evenly spaced, deliberate. Cora opened the door. She had expected Harwick or one of the elders, sent to inform her that she would need to vacate her cabin for the duration of the AlphaKing's visit. A common enough humiliation, the kind she had learned to absorb without visible reaction. She had, in fact, already begun moving her more fragile herb bundles to the high shelf in case she needed to clear the space quickly. She had not expected the AlphaKing to be standing on her threshold. He was taller than she had imagined from the window. Dark hair, jaw sharp enough to cast shadow. He wore riding leathers and a heavy wool cloak, both dusted with the first fine particles of snow that had just begun to fall. Behind him, at a respectful distance, stood Harwick and 2 of the king's riders, all of them carefully not looking at the cabin's exterior walls. Cora's eyes moved briefly to the dead sunflower stalks on either side of the door. She looked back at the man before her. "My king," she said. Her voice was even. Lucian looked at her. Then, without asking permission, he looked past her into the cabin. He took in the fire, the herbs, the careful organization of a space that held nothing unnecessary. Then he looked back at her face. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm, which was, in his experience, a different thing entirely. "You planted those yourself," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He glanced at the arc of brown stalks along the cabin's west and north walls. Then he looked at the sky. Snow was beginning to fall in earnest now. Thin flakes, but many of them. "Why?" he asked. She held his gaze for just a moment longer than was typical for an Omega addressing a king. Then she said very simply, "Because I knew the blizzard was coming." He didn't move. "And sunflowers," he said slowly, "stop a blizzard." "Their roots do," she said. planted deep enough, at the right intervals, along the wind-facing walls. They anchor the soil, reduce the drift, and break the force of the wind before it reaches the foundation. This cabin will hold. The ones with no wind barrier. She didn't look toward the main settlement, but the direction was clear. We'll lose roof panels before morning. The snow was thickening around them, falling soft and cold onto her shawl and his dark cloak alike. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Harwick. How long has she been out here alone? Nearly 3 years, my king. And she has never been moved to a more central. She is an Omega, Harwick said, as if this were a sufficient explanation. Lucian's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A slow shift, like weight redistributing. He looked back at Cora. "May I come in?" he asked. It was the last thing she had expected him to say. And the question, quiet, almost formal, hung in the cold air between them while the snow fell heavier. And somewhere behind her, the fire crackled steadily in the hearth, and the roots of 37 dead sunflowers held the earth in place around her door. Cora stepped back from the door. It was a small gesture, wordless, neither warm nor cold. But it was an answer, and Lucian accepted it as one. He stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the low timber frame, and the 2 riders moved to follow. He stopped them with a single raised hand without turning to look. They stayed outside. Harwick opened his mouth. "You as well," Lucian said. The door closed. The cabin was small enough that his presence immediately changed the geometry of it. Not through intimidation, though the sheer size of him in the low-ceilinged space was undeniable, but through attention. He looked at everything with the focused, unhurried gaze of someone accustomed to reading environments, rather than merely inhabiting them. The herb bundles, the careful stack of firewood beside the hearth, enough for 3 days of steady burning. The clay pots arranged by size on the shelf. The single thick wool blanket folded precisely at the foot of the narrow sleeping pallet. He said nothing for a long moment. Cora moved to the fire and added a small piece of wood. Not because it needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands while she recalibrated her understanding of the evening. An hour ago, she had been preparing for a quiet night alone with the incoming storm. Now, the Alpha King of all northern packs was standing in her cabin, examining her dried yarrow with the expression of a man cataloging something he had not expected to find. "You know medicinal herbs," he said. "Some." "Which ones?" She looked at him. "All of them that grow within 3 hours' walk of this ridge." He turned from the shelf. "Who taught you?" "My grandmother." "And before her?" The question was more perceptive than she had anticipated. Most people, when they learned about her grandmother, stopped there, satisfied with 1 generation of explanation. He had asked for the layer beneath. "Her mother," Cora said. "And her mother's mother. It is the kind of knowledge that passes quietly, because it is not the kind anyone thinks to record." Lucian moved to the window and looked out. The snow was no longer gentle. In the short time since he had stepped inside, the flakes had grown dense and wind-driven, and the light outside had shifted to the flat gray-white that preceded serious accumulation. He could hear it now, a low, constant pressure against the western wall of the cabin, and against that pressure, the faintest structural resistance. The cabin was not shaking. "Your pack thinks you planted those flowers for decoration," he said. "I know what my pack thinks." "You didn't correct them." "No." He turned from the window. "Why not?" Cora considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding how much of it was worth saying aloud to a man she had met 7 minutes ago, regardless of his title. "Because it is easier," she said finally, "to be underestimated than to spend energy defending knowledge that people have already decided not to believe." Something crossed his face. Not pity. she would have closed down entirely at pity. It was something closer to recognition, as if she had described a landscape he had seen before from a different angle. "How deep are the roots?" he asked. "The deepest ones reach nearly 4 feet. I planted those first, in late spring when the ground was still soft. The outer ring is shallower, 2 feet, but there are more of them, closer together. The spacing matters as much as the depth." She paused. "The wind comes from the northwest here in a true blizzard. The arc follows that angle." "You calculated that?" "I observed it. 3 winters in one place teaches you things about wind." Lucian was quiet for a moment. Outside, something struck the outer wall. A branch, most likely, or a piece of loose material from one of the nearby structures that had not been adequately secured. Cora's cabin absorbed the impact without trembling. "Your lodge," she said carefully. "The main hall. Is it full?" He looked at her. "Nearly. Harwick is consolidating the pack now. The families on the eastern row have a gap between the rear wall and the storage shed. When the wind shifts, and it will shift around midnight, the draft through that gap will undermine the heat in the 3 closest homes. The children in those homes should be moved before the temperature drops." He held her gaze. "You've thought about this. I've thought about every structure in this settlement. I have 3 years of evenings and very little conversation to fill them with." It was the driest thing she had said, and she had not meant it to be. But something in his expression shifted. The severe line of his mouth eased, fractionally. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same family. "I'll send Aldrich to handle the eastern row," he said. Then, without ceremony, he crossed to the single chair beside the hearth and sat down. Not with the sprawling ease of a man claiming territory, but with the careful economy of someone who had been in the saddle since before dawn and was making a practical decision. "You're staying," Cora said. "The pass is closed by now. We stay until the storm breaks." He looked at her. "You object?" She looked around her cabin. 1 chair, 1 pallet. Enough firewood. Enough dried food. Enough herbs. She had, in fact, prepared for isolation, not company. But the cabin was the safest structure on the edge of the settlement, and they both knew it. "I don't object," she said, "but I have questions. Ask them." She sat on the wooden chest near the hearth, the closest thing to a second seat the cabin offered, and folded her hands in her lap. "Why did you come to the door yourself? You could have sent Harwick. You could have sent one of your riders." "Harwick," Lucian said, "told me an Omega had been living alone on the outer edge for 3 years, and said it with the tone of a man who considered that a natural arrangement. I wanted to see what that arrangement looked like." "And?" "It looks like a woman who has been managing alone because no one considered it worth questioning." Cora absorbed this without expression. That is an accurate description. "It doesn't bother you that I'm here naming it plainly?" "It might bother me later," she said. "At the moment I am still deciding whether you name it plainly because you intend to change something, or because you find honesty convenient when it costs you nothing." The fire crackled between them. Lucian looked at her with an attention that was not comfortable but was not unkind. "You speak to kings this way. I don't know many kings. Only the one currently sitting in my only chair." This time the shift in his expression was unmistakable. A brief, genuine thing, there and gone. "Then I'll answer plainly as well. I don't yet know what I intend to change. I know what I've seen in the past hour, and I know it unsettles me. Whether that leads to action depends on what else I learn before the storm breaks." It was, Cora thought, a more honest answer than she had expected. Not a promise, not a performance of benevolence, just the shape of a man who was thinking. She stood and moved to the pot on the shelf. "There is broth. It's simple, dried meat and root vegetables, but it's hot." "That's enough," he said. She ladled it without flourish and handed him a clay bowl, and he took it the same way, without ceremony, both hands, the way a person did when they were genuinely cold and genuinely grateful and not thinking about how it looked. They sat in the firelight while the blizzard built outside, and the roots of 37 sunflowers held the ground firm around the cabin walls, and Cora watched the Alpha King of the Northern Packs drink plain broth from a chipped clay bowl and found that she was not afraid of him. She was not entirely sure what she was, but it was not that. In the main lodge, Aldrich moved through the eastern row of homes with the brisk efficiency of a man following an order he had not questioned, because the king had given it. He found exactly what Cora had described: a gap between the storage shed and the rear wall of the third house, wide enough to push a forearm through, angled directly into the path of the wind. He moved 4 children and their mothers to the main hall. Then he stood in the snow outside the lodge and looked toward the faint glow of the small cabin at the edge of the settlement. He had ridden with Lucian for 11 years. He had seen the king eat at high tables in great halls and in the dirt beside battlefield fires. He had never seen him eat in a place like that, a single-room cabin with a chipped shelf and 1 chair. He pulled his cloak tighter and went inside. Behind him, the storm closed like a fist around the mountain. Inside the main lodge, pressed against the wall near the fire with her arms around her 2 youngest children, a woman named Dasha watched Harwick pace near the door. He had been pacing since Aldrich came through with the relocation order, since it had become clear that someone, the writers would not say who, but it was not difficult to guess, had known about the eastern gap before anyone in the lodge had thought to check it. She thought of Cora, out in the small cabin. Alone, supposedly. Unimportant, supposedly. She pulled her children closer and watched the snow hammer the shuttered windows, and thought that perhaps she had been wrong about several things for a very long time. The blizzard hit its full force somewhere around the middle of the night. Cora knew it by sound before she knew it by anything else. The wind stopped being a presence and became a voice, low and continuous, pressing against the western wall with a steady, deliberate weight. The fire in the hearth responded by pulling harder, the flame leaning inward as the draft through the chimney changed direction. She added 2 pieces of wood without waking from the half-sleep she had fallen into, sitting upright against the wall with her shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders. Lucian was still in the chair. She did not know when he had stopped being awake and started being asleep. But the distinction had happened quietly, the way things did when a person was exhausted enough to stop managing their own consciousness. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees and his head dropped forward, his breathing slow and even. The firelight moved across his face in warm intervals, and without the full weight of his attention aimed at something, he looked. Not younger, exactly, but less assembled. Less like a title and more like a person. Cora looked at him for a moment longer than was polite, then looked away. Outside, the wind shifted. She heard it in the walls, a subtle change in the harmonic of the pressure, the sound moving from a low push to something higher and more turbulent. The midnight shift she had told him about. The roots outside tightened against the frozen soil without being asked, holding the earth in place around the cabin's foundation, the way they had been growing toward for 6 months. She stood carefully, trying not to disturb the air too much, and moved to the window. The world outside was completely white. Not white like snow on a clear day, white like erasure, like the mountain had decided to unmake itself. She could see nothing past the arc of dead stalks at the cabin's edge, each one rigid and frost-covered, each one still standing. Good. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and let out a slow breath, and the breath fogged the pain, and for a moment she could see her own reflection dimly. A woman in a wool shawl, with dark circles beneath her eyes, and hair that had come loose from its braid sometime in the last few hours. 3 years. The thought arrived the way it sometimes did at night, when the silence was big enough to hold it. A flat, honest accounting of time. 3 years in this cabin. 3 years of being the Omega. the pack forgot to worry about because she never gave them cause. 3 years of planting things, learning things, preparing for things that no one else was preparing for. She did not feel sorry for herself. She had made choices, and the choices had kept her safe and capable, and that was worth more than sympathy. But she was aware, in the particular clarity of 2 o'clock in the morning, with a blizzard pressing against her walls, that safety and capability were not the same as belonging. That she had built a very sturdy life inside a very long silence. "You're not sleeping." His voice came without warning, and she turned, her hand still against the cold glass. Lucian was awake, or had been awake, she could not tell, watching her from the chair. "I sleep lightly during storms," she said. "Old habit." "From when you were young?" "From when I moved here." She came back to her place against the wall and sat down. "The first winter I was in this cabin, I didn't know yet which sounds meant danger and which ones were ordinary. I woke up every few hours to check. And now? Now I can tell by sound alone whether it's the roof structure, the foundation, the chimney, or just the wind looking for a way in." He was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You've learned to read this place the way a soldier learns to read a fortification." "I suppose that's one way to describe it." "How would you describe it?" Cora considered. "I would say I've learned to stop being afraid of it and start being in conversation with it." The fire popped. Somewhere outside, muffled by snow and distance, something fell. A tree branch, heavy with ice. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. The request was unexpected enough that she answered it before she decided whether to. "She was the healer for a small pack in the eastern foothills. Very small. 30 people, perhaps less by the time I was born. She knew things that most healers had forgotten because most healers had access to easier remedies, so they never needed the older ones. And she taught you. She taught me everything she could before she died. I was 17. Cora paused. "She also taught me that in a pack, a healer who is a woman of low rank is a useful tool. A healer who is a woman of low rank, and also correct when the higher-ranking members are wrong, is a problem." Lucian's expression shifted. "Is that what happened to her?" "She was not harmed, if that's what you're asking. But she was quietly moved to the outer edge of the settlement in her last years, and her knowledge was used without acknowledgement. And when she died, the pack's new healer, a man of middle rank who had trained for 2 seasons, was celebrated at a formal gathering, and she was not mentioned." The words sat in the warm air between them. "That," Lucian said carefully, "is a familiar pattern. I imagine you see it often, from where you sit." "I see it more than I act on it. That is its own failure." He said it plainly, without drama, the admission of a man who had thought about this specific thing before, and had not yet resolved it to his own satisfaction. Cora looked at him. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you told me something true. It seemed like an equal exchange." She almost said something and then didn't. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them and looked at the fire. After a moment, she said, "What brought you south this time? Truly, not the tribute visit." "Border trouble. 3 packs reporting movement in the contested forest between the northern and southern territories. Not raiders. Something more organized. Supplies moving in a pattern, camps appearing and disappearing." He shook his head slightly. "Someone is building toward something, and I don't yet know who." "How long has it been happening?" 3 months of clear evidence. Possibly longer before that, if the early reports were being suppressed. Suppressed by whom? His jaw tightened fractionally. "That is the question I am riding south to answer." Cora filed this away without comment. She thought about patterns. The same thing she thought about when she was planning which plants to put where, which herbs to dry in which season, which structural weaknesses in a building would matter most when the worst weather came. Patterns were information. Patterns told you what was actually happening underneath what appeared to be happening. The pack leaders along the southern border, she said slowly. Do they communicate regularly with each other? They're supposed to. But do they? He looked at her with sharpened attention. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that if something is being organized in contested forest, the most useful thing would be for the border packs to not be communicating. For each one to think the movement is localized, not widespread. For the pattern to be invisible to anyone who is only seeing one piece of it. Silence. You, Lucian said, have been thinking about border politics alone in this cabin. I've been thinking about how information moves and why it sometimes doesn't. The mechanism is the same whether you're talking about packs or plants. He leaned forward. If the border packs aren't sharing what they're seeing, then someone has made it advantageous for them to stay quiet, or made them afraid to speak, or given each of them a private reason to believe their own piece of the problem is already being handled. Lucian was completely still in the way that she was beginning to recognize, not frozen, but concentrated. All of his attention gathered into a single unmoving point. There is a man named Edric, he said, a southern pack leader. He came to the last council meeting and spoke at length about the stability of the border. Reassured everyone. Provided numbers. And after the meeting, did the other border pack leaders feel less urgency about reporting what they were seeing? A pause. A long one. Yes, he said. The fire crackled. The wind moved around the cabin in its altered midnight pattern, and the roots beneath the snow held the earth firm. And Cora watched the Alpha King sit with a new understanding settling across his face like weather, the kind that changed the shape of the landscape it moved through. I came to Iron Ridge for water and shelter, he said, and I find a woman who has solved 2 of my problems before dawn. I haven't solved anything, she said. I've only asked questions. The right questions are worth more than most answers. She looked at the fire. The right questions are what people like me ask, because we are not given the opportunity to provide answers. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that held something. A shift, a reckoning. The quiet sound of a perspective changing underneath the surface like roots moving through soil, slow and invisible and permanent. In the main lodge, Harwick sat awake near the banked fire, watching the shutters strain against the wind. 63 people were breathing through the night in various states of warmth and rest, and by his count, not one of them had been lost to the storm. He should have felt relieved. Instead, he kept thinking about the Eastern Gap, about the children who had been moved before the wind shifted, about who had known to move them, and when, and how. He thought about Cora in her cabin at the edge of the settlement, with her dead sunflower stalks, and her quiet eyes, and her 3 years of being exactly where he had put her. He had been telling himself for 3 years that she was fine out there, that she preferred it, that the distance was practical, not punitive. He sat with the fire and the storm, and tried to remember when exactly he had started believing his own story. The storm broke just before dawn. Not gently. Storms like this one did not ease themselves out. They simply stopped, the way a held breath releases all at once, and suddenly there was silence where there had been roaring pressure, and the world outside went from violent white to the particular stillness of deep snow under a clearing sky. Cora heard the change and opened her eyes. She had slept, finally, an hour, perhaps 2, sitting against the wall with her shawl pulled up to her chin. The fire had burned down to a deep orange bed of coals that still held significant heat. She added wood without fully waking, and the flames caught immediately, and she sat for a moment in the warmth and let consciousness reassemble itself. Lucian was awake. He was standing at the window, looking out at the white world with his arms crossed over his chest and his riding cloak back around his shoulders. The light coming through the glass was the thin, bright blue of early morning after heavy snowfall, sharp and clean and merciless. "How deep?" she asked. "Nearly to the top of your fence posts, perhaps deeper in the drifts." She stood, straightening her back against the familiar ache of sleeping upright, and moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the clearing around the cabin was transformed. Everything smoothed and softened under several feet of snow. The familiar shapes of rocks and pathways and woodpiles turned into gentle mounds. The arc of sunflower stalks was buried to half their height, but they were still standing. The cabin's walls were clean and undamaged. Where the wind would have driven snow against the foundation under normal conditions, the root system had held the soil firm, and the drift had broken around the cabin in a clean curve, like water around a stone. "They held," Lucian said quietly. "They always hold," Cora said. "That was the point." He looked at her, a sideways glance, brief but considering. Then he looked back at the clearing and at the path that led toward the main settlement. From this distance, even through the morning brightness, she could see that 2 of the structures along the northern row had damage visible against the sky. One missing a section of roof panel, another with a wall that had partially buckled under the drift weight. Exactly where she had expected. "I need to check on my riders," Lucian said. "I know." He turned from the window but stopped before reaching the door. His back was to her, and there was a pause that had weight in it. The pause of a person composing something they are not entirely sure how to say. "When I leave Iron Ridge," he said, "I intend to speak with Harwick about your situation here." Cora said nothing. "I don't mean as a grand gesture," he continued, still not turning. "I mean specifically and practically. You should not be on the outer edge alone. Your knowledge should be used, not tolerated. And the arrangement that placed you here deserves examination. Harwick will tell you I chose this. Did you?" She considered the honest answer. "I chose not to fight it. That is a different thing." He turned then and looked at her directly. "Yes, it is." She met his gaze without flinching, but also without performance. "I appreciate the intention. I am cautious about the outcome. Pack structures do not change because a king speaks to a beta once during a storm visit." "No," he agreed. "They don't. But they can change when a king decides the matter warrants continued attention." She studied him. "Why does it warrant yours?" "Because I have ridden through a great many settlements, and I have learned to recognize the moment when a place is functioning on a false story. Iron Ridge is functioning on the story that you are a low-value member who was correctly placed. That story is wrong in a way that wastes something real." He paused. "I dislike waste." It was a practical framing, deliberately so, she suspected. He was not offering sentiment. He was offering something more durable, a reasoned position that didn't require him to feel anything in particular to hold. She found unexpectedly that she respected it. "Then I will tell you one more thing before you go," she said. "About Edric." He was immediately still. "Go on." 3 months ago, a rider passed through Iron Ridge carrying a sealed message. He was not a royal messenger. The colors were wrong. The saddle markings were unfamiliar. He stopped at the lodge for perhaps an hour, and then continued south. Harwick met with him privately, and told no one what was discussed. "I saw the rider from this window." She nodded toward the eastern glass. "I could not read the markings, but I noted the pattern on the saddlecloth. It was a river and bridge pattern. I have seen that pattern before, on a banner from the Southern Territories." Lucian did not move. The Southern Territories. Edric's region. "I don't know that it was Edric's man. I only know the pattern, and I know that Harwick did not mention the visit to anyone afterward. And I know that 2 weeks later he changed the grazing rotation to bring more of the pack's livestock to the southern pasture." She paused. "Which is closer to the contested forest." The silence in the cabin was a different quality now, still and focused. "You documented this?" he asked. "In my own way." She crossed to the wooden chest she had been sitting on during the night, opened it, and withdrew a small folded piece of leather. On the inside surface, burned carefully with a narrow iron tool, were a series of marks, dates, shapes, directional notations. Not writing in any formal sense. Something older and more personal. She held it out. He took it carefully, unfolded it, and looked at it for a long moment. She watched him read the pattern of marks, and watched the moment when his expression confirmed that he understood what he was looking at. "How long have you been keeping this?" he asked. "Since the first winter. I keep notes on everything that seems out of pattern. Weather, animal behavior, visitor movements, changes in pack routine. Most of it is ordinary. Some of it is not. And you showed no one. No one asked." He looked up at her. The morning light from the window fell across his face in full now, and she could see the particular quality of his stillness. Not calm, but controlled. A man who had just received a piece of information that rearranged other pieces he had been carrying, and who was very carefully not showing how significant the rearrangement was. "I would like to take this," he said. "You may." "I will return it." "That is not necessary." "It is to me." He folded the leather carefully and placed it inside his cloak. "What you have recorded here is evidence in a matter that may become serious. You deserve to have it returned once it has served its purpose." Cora looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. He moved toward the door, and she followed to see it opened, not from ceremony, but because the snowdrift would have pushed against the base overnight, and the door required a firm lift and push to clear it. She did this without comment, the practiced motion of someone who had done it many mornings before, and the door swung open onto a wall of cold and white light. His two riders were outside, already on their feet, breath clouding the frozen air. They straightened when they saw him. Behind them, across the clearing, figures from the main settlement were beginning to emerge. People assessing the damage, moving through the drifts, voices carrying thin and clear in the post-storm silence. Lucian stepped out, then turned back. "Your name," he said. "I want to know it formally." "Cora," she said. "No other name. My grandmother's line did not keep formal family names." "Cora," he repeated. Then, "The pack will be without a functioning roof on the northern structure. Do you have materials here that could be used for emergency repair?" "There is pine board in the storage lean-to on the south side, and I have pine resin mixed with ash that serves as a sealant in cold conditions. It sets hard within 2 hours." "Will you come and help?" She paused. It was not the dangerous sort of pause, not resistance. It was the pause of a person recalibrating the landscape of a situation that had shifted without warning. "You're asking me," she said. "I am. Not Harwick." "Harwick," Lucian said evenly, "does not know about the pine resin sealant. You do." She reached back inside for her heavier cloak, the dark green wool one she kept for serious cold, and pulled it around her shoulders. She picked up the small clay pot of sealant from the shelf, without being asked, and stepped out into the snow. What happened in the next 2 hours was not dramatic. It was cold and physical and practical. Boards lifted into place, sealant applied with careful strokes, snow cleared from buckled supports, judgments made about which damage was structural and which was cosmetic. Cora worked without announcement, moving from problem to problem with the focused efficiency of someone who had been solving physical problems alone for a long time, and was simply, now, doing it in the presence of others. The others watched her, not with hostility, with the particular attention of people who are seeing something familiar in an unfamiliar light. Dasha, the woman from the eastern row who had spent the night in the main lodge with her children, brought hot water in a clay pitcher without being asked, and handed it to Cora without a word. Their eyes met briefly. Dasha looked away first. Harwick stood at the edge of the activity with his arms crossed, watching Lucian and Cora move through the damaged structures together. His expression was unreadable to most. To Cora, who had 3 years of practice reading the specific quality of his silences, it read as a man in the early stages of understanding that a story he had been telling had a different ending than he had planned for. Good, she thought. Let him sit with it. She was halfway through applying sealant to the worst gap in the northern roof when she became aware of a new presence at the settlement's edge. A rider. Single. Coming fast from the south, pushing through the deep snow with the particular urgency of someone carrying news that could not wait for weather to clear. Lucian saw him at the same moment she did. Their eyes met across the roof beam, and she saw in his face the confirmation of something she had already felt, like a change in air pressure before weather arrived. Whatever was building in the southern forest had just accelerated. The rider's name was Peter. He was young, barely past 20, lean in the way of someone who had been riding hard for days without adequate food. And his horse was lathered despite the cold, steam rising from its dark coat in visible clouds as it came to a stop in the middle of the settlement clearing. Peter swung down before the animal had fully stilled, stumbled once in the deep snow, and caught himself with the practiced reflex of someone trained not to fall in front of people. Lucian was already moving toward him. Cora stayed where she was on the northern roof, one hand still holding the pine resin brush, and watched from above. She had a clear sightline to the exchange. She could not hear the words. Petter was speaking low and fast, his breath coming in visible bursts in the cold air. But she could read the shape of the conversation in the way bodies arranged themselves. Aldrich, who had joined them, took a half step back when he heard something. Lucian went very still. That particular stillness she was beginning to know. She set down the brush and climbed down from the roof. She did not approach the group directly. She moved to the storage lean-to on the pretense of returning the clay pot, and she was close enough to catch fragments as she passed. 3 pack leaders, southern border. All 3 sent riders at once, my king. The messages arrived within hours of each other. Edric's territory specifically, they're saying he's been meeting privately with... She kept walking. She had heard enough. Inside the lean-to, she set the pot on its shelf and stood for a moment in the cold dark, the smell of pine resin and old wood thick around her. She thought about the leather piece she had given Lucian. She thought about the rider with the river and bridge saddlecloth. She thought about Harwick's changed grazing rotation and the private meeting he had not mentioned to anyone. She thought about patterns. A hand pulled the lean-to door open. Lucian ducked inside and pulled it nearly shut behind him, leaving only a thin line of light and cold air. 3 southern border pack leaders have sent simultaneous emergency messages, he said quietly. They've been tracking the same organized movement in the contested forest for months. They weren't reporting it, because each of them believed the others had already informed the Crown and been told it was under control. Edric told each of them separately that you already knew, Cora said. A pause. Yes. And they believed him because he is a pack leader of long standing, and there was no reason not to. Yes. She looked at the wall of the lean-to. How many people in the contested forest? The most recent count from the southernmost pack puts it at nearly 200, armed, organized into rotating camps, so no single position is held long enough to be identified as permanent. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing underneath it. Not fear, but the focused urgency of a man doing rapid calculations with serious numbers. It has been building for months, quietly, deliberately. While Edric reassured the council, while Edric attended every council meeting and spoke at length about border stability and provided numbers that were, I now understand, entirely fabricated. Cora turned to face him. He was in your council meetings. He has been a pack leader for 18 years. He earned his seat and used it to block the information that would have stopped this. Lucian looked at her steadily. Yes. The lean-to was very small. The cold came through the gaps in the boards, and she could see her breath and his overlapping in the cramped space. She was aware that the conversation they were having was several layers more serious than anything she had anticipated when she woke this morning. "What do you do now?" she asked. "I ride south immediately. Aldrich is already preparing the horses. I need to consolidate the 3 border packs, establish a unified position, and deal with Edric before whatever he has built in that forest becomes operational. You'll need to move before he learns that the 3 leaders have compared accounts. I know. If he finds out they've spoken to each other and that their messages reached you, he will accelerate whatever he is planning. Yes." Lucian's jaw was tight. "I have perhaps 2 days before he realizes the information barrier has broken down." "Then you have less time than that," Cora said. "Harwick met with one of his riders 3 months ago." The silence that followed was absolute. "You think Harwick is informing for him?" Lucian said. "I think Harwick received a private visit from someone carrying Edric's markings and told no one. I think he changed his pack's grazing pattern toward the southern forest shortly after. I think he has been beta of this pack for 12 years and has built a comfortable position that would benefit from knowing which direction the next wind is coming from." She paused. "I think Harwick would not have assigned an Omega who notices patterns to the outer edge of the settlement by accident." Lucian went still in a way she had not seen before. This was not the concentrated stillness of a man thinking. This was the stillness of a man absorbing a strike. "He put you out there," Lucian said slowly, "because you were the kind of person who would notice things. And out there, whatever I noticed wouldn't reach anyone useful. Until now. Until a blizzard sent you to the only structurally sound building on the edge of the settlement." Outside, she could hear Aldrich's voice carrying across the clearing, the sounds of horses being readied, the creak of saddle leather, and the muffled clank of packed gear. The world was resuming its urgency. She could feel it pressing against the walls of the lean-to like the storm had pressed against her cabin walls. Real, undeniable, requiring action. "I have to handle Harwick before I leave," Lucian said. "I know. And I cannot leave this pack without stable leadership during a period of border crisis. I know that too." He looked at her directly. "I am going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not a careful one. I'll try. Is there anyone in this pack besides Harwick who you believe is connected to Edric's network?" She thought about it, genuinely, not reflexively. She went through the pack in her mind the way she went through her herb shelf, methodically assigning each one its correct category. She thought about faces and behaviors and small deviations from pattern over 3 years of quiet observation. "One person," she said finally. "A man named Callum. He manages the pack's trade records. He travels to the southern market 3 times a year, which is normal for his role. But in the last year his trips have become less predictable in timing. He goes when he should not need to, and delays when he should go. And he and Harwick have taken to eating their evening meal together, which they did not do before the last winter." Lucian listened to every word with the focused quality of a man committing something to exact memory. "Anyone else?" "Not that I can identify with confidence. There may be others I haven't seen clearly." "That is an honest answer. You asked for one." He nodded once. Then he said, "I am going to leave 2 of my riders here, ostensibly to assist with storm repair. Actually to ensure that Harwick and Callum do not send any messages south before I reach Edric." "And Harwick himself?" "Aldrich will speak with him before we leave. Formally, on my authority, removing him from the beta position pending investigation. He won't know what specific evidence exists. He will only know that the king has concerns." He paused. "It will be frightening and unclear, which is what I want. A frightened man waiting for clarity does not act. Who leads the pack while Harwick is suspended?" Lucian looked at her. She felt the look land. "No," she said immediately. "I am not appointing you Beta. I am asking you to serve as the pack's interim advisor to my 2 remaining riders until I return or send a formal replacement. Your knowledge of this pack, its structures, its needs, and its vulnerabilities is greater than anyone else here. You proved that before dawn this morning. The pack will not accept guidance from an Omega. The pack will accept guidance from a woman who knew the Eastern Gap would fail before it failed, who sealed their roof this morning, and who has, as of today, the visible backing of the AlphaKing." He tilted his head slightly. "Additionally, Dasha brought you water without being asked. Small things move first." Cora stood with this for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, moved to the outer edge of her pack in her final years. She thought about the knowledge that passed quietly, hand to hand, generation to generation, because it was not the kind anyone thought to record. She thought about 3 years of evenings with nothing but questions to fill them. She thought about 37 sunflower roots holding the earth firm in the dark, through months of cold, unseen and unthanked, doing exactly what they had been grown to do. "I'll do it," she said. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Come back and deal with the aftermath properly, and then we can discuss gratitude." Something in his face did what it had done the night before, that brief, genuine shift. This time it lasted a fraction longer. "I will come back," he said. "That is not a reassurance. It is a statement of intent." "There is a difference," she acknowledged. "Yes." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Snowlight fell across his shoulder and the dark wool of his cloak. "The leather record I took from you. The marks. What about it?" "The last notation on it. The one in the lower right corner, more recent than the others. What does it mean?" She looked at him steadily. "It means that 2 nights before your arrival, I heard wolves in the northern woods. Not local wolves. The track patterns I found the next morning were too large and moving in a coordinated line formation. Something was scouting this settlement." The silence stretched. "You knew something was coming," he said. "I knew something had already arrived and was deciding what to do next. I didn't know what. I still don't know if it was connected to the Southern movement or something separate." "It's connected," he said quietly. "The northern approaches are part of the same network, which means Iron Ridge is not simply a pass-through settlement. It is a position." He looked at her. "Which means I need you here more than I realized, and I need my riders here more than I planned. How many will you keep?" "All of them, but Aldrich, and 1 other." He pulled the door open. Cold poured in. "You were right about the patterns, Cora. All of them." She pulled her cloak tighter. "Go," she said. "You're burning daylight." He left within the hour. She watched the small riding party move south through the deep snow. 3 figures on horseback, Lucian at the center, Aldrich to his left, the 3rd rider a length behind. They moved with purpose, without looking back, and the snow swallowed them gradually until there was only the trail of hoofprints left, already beginning to fill at the edges as the wind picked up again. 4 of his riders remained in the settlement. Harwick had gone very pale when Aldrich spoke to him. He had not argued, which told Cora everything about how much he understood of what had been found. He was confined to the lodge and had not come outside since. Dasha was standing beside Cora when the riders disappeared from view. "He'll come back," Dasha said. It was not entirely clear whether she was reassuring Cora or herself. "He said he would," Cora replied. She turned away from the southern path and looked at the settlement, the damaged roofs, the people moving through the snow, the 4 royal riders already integrating themselves with careful efficiency into the daily life of the pack. The work ahead was visible and real and large. "We have a roof to finish," she said. Dasha nodded and followed her without being asked. Behind them, at the edge of the settlement, the frozen stalks of 37 sunflowers stood in their arc around the small cabin, catching the late morning light, holding their position in the snow-packed earth as they had held it through the entire long night of the storm, patient, deliberate, and stronger than they looked. Fim do bloco 5. Final da história. Contagem de palavras. 1. 944 palavras. Epílogo. 6 weeks later, the snow had begun to pull back from the lower slopes of the mountain. Edric was brought before the full council of pack leaders in chains. Not as a humiliation, but as a statement of fact. The evidence against him was substantial. The fabricated border reports, the private messenger network, the 200 armed men found in the contested forest, dispersed and disarmed over 4 days of coordinated action by the consolidated border packs under Lucian's direct command. 3 pack leaders gave formal testimony. Harwick and Callum, faced with the complete picture of what they had been part of, provided additional accounts in exchange for reduced consequences. Edric said very little. He had the expression of a man who had believed his own plan was invisible, until the moment it was not, and who had not yet adjusted to the new reality. The council's judgment was removal, from his position, his territory, and the northern lands entirely. Lucian rode back to Iron Ridge on a morning when the first pale shoots of new growth were visible along the southern-facing slopes. He came with Aldrich and 2 other riders, and no announcement. The settlement saw him coming from half a mile away, and the word moved through the pack quietly, person to person, with the particular speed of news that matters. Cora was at the northern roof when he arrived. The repair she had started the morning after the blizzard had expanded, over 6 weeks, into a full structural reinforcement. Better materials, better technique, a design she had worked out with 2 of the pack's builders who had, tentatively at first, and then with increasing directness, started bringing her their questions. She climbed down when she heard the horses. He looked different than he had the morning he left. Not rested, exactly, but resolved. The quality of a man who had done something difficult and finished it. He dismounted and handed his reins to Aldrich, and walked across the clearing toward her. And the people of Iron Ridge watched him do it without pretending not to watch. He stopped a few feet away. She had snow on her shoulders and pine pitch on her hands, and her hair had come loose from its braid again, the way it always did when she was working. "It's done," he said. "I know. Aldrich's second rider came through 4 days ago with the council's ruling." She paused. "Harwick?" "Formally removed. He'll stand before a review panel in the spring. He cooperated, which will be weighed accordingly. He won't lead again." Lucian looked at her directly. Callum similarly. She nodded. "The pack is stable. Your riders managed it well. And the people, they adapted more quickly than I expected. Or they had better guidance than they expected." She didn't argue with that. She had learned, over 6 weeks, that arguing with accurate statements was a waste of energy. What happens now with Iron Ridge? A new beta will be formally appointed. I have someone in mind, a woman from the Eastern Settlement who has held informal leadership there for years without the title. He watched her face. "Her name is Senna. You would like her, I think. You investigated. I asked questions. The way someone once told me the right questions are worth more than most answers." Cora looked at him. There was something in this conversation, a shape to it, a direction, that she was aware of without yet having named. She had been aware of it for 6 weeks, in the particular way you are aware of weather that has not arrived yet. "And me?" she asked, plainly, without performance. "That depends on what you want," he said, "which is a question I am asking you directly, not as a king making a decision, but as a person who has thought about your answer for 6 weeks and would like to hear it from you." She looked at the settlement around her. The repaired roof. The people going about their morning work. Dasha's children playing in the last of the deep snow near the southern fence, their voices thin and bright in the cold air. She looked at the cabin at the edge of the clearing, and the arc of dead sunflower stalks that were beginning, just barely, at the base of several stems, to show the first pale sign of next year's growth. "I don't want to leave," she said. "This is my place. I built something here, even if no one named it that for a long time." She paused. "But I don't want to be invisible in it anymore." "You won't be," he said. "Not while I have anything to say about it, and I intend to have quite a lot to say about it, on a regular basis." He held her gaze. "I will come back here, Cora. Not for the settlement stability reports, though those matter. For the conversations. For the questions." She considered this. Then she said, "You should know that I have started a more formal record, not on leather with burn marks, proper materials, paper, ink. Everything I know about this territory, the plants, the structures, the patterns, I've been writing it for 6 weeks." His expression shifted in the way she had come to recognize that genuine, unguarded thing. "Good. It will take years to complete. Then I had better keep coming back." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come to her door in a snowstorm, asking why sunflowers stopped a blizzard, who had drunk plain broth from a chipped bowl and listened to her speak about patterns until the fire burned low, who had ridden south into serious danger carrying a piece of burned leather like it was something valuable, because it was. "Yes," she said, "you had better." The sunflowers would grow again in spring. They always did. Not because anyone tended them specifically, but because their roots were deep enough to survive whatever the winter brought. And deep roots, Cora's grandmother had always said, are what distinguishes something that lasts from something that merely survives a single season. By summer, the settlement at Iron Ridge had a new beta, a formal healer's record that the Pack Council voted to keep in the Common Archive, and a small addition built onto the northern wall of a certain cabin at the settlement's edge. Not because Cora had asked for it, but because 6 of the Pack's builders had arrived one morning with timber and tools, and said without much ceremony that the space was too small for the work being done in it. She had not argued. Lucien came back 4 times that year. Each visit was practical. There were always matters of territory, of record, of the ongoing restructuring of the southern border arrangements that required attention. Each visit also lasted longer than strictly necessary, and ended with conversations that had nothing to do with borders or records, and everything to do with 2 people who had found, in a blizzard, that they were genuinely interested in each other's minds. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was declared. Some things do not need to be announced. They simply grow, the way roots grow in the dark and the cold, quietly and with great patience, until the season turns and everyone can see what was always there. Aldrich, who had ridden with Lucien for 11 years and prided himself on missing nothing, noticed all of it and said nothing whatsoever. He was a man who understood that some things moved in their own time, and that the best thing you could do was make sure the horses were fed and the road south remained open. Cora, for her part, planted the next year's sunflowers slightly wider, a larger arc, covering more ground, more carefully spaced. She had more to protect now, and her roots had always been deep enough for that.